My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 73 years old, a widow, and I live in a small blue house at the edge of Spokane, Washington. It's quiet here, too quiet sometimes. My husband, Walter, passed away 9 years ago, and ever since then, my days have followed a soft rhythm: morning tea, a bit of gardening, reading the same paper I've been reading for decades, and checking the mail even when I know it's just going to be bills or ads. I've built a life that's modest, but mine. Last Sunday, my son Brian and his wife Lindsay came by. They said they were just dropping in to check on me, and I believed them. At least, I wanted to. Brian looked polished as always, his business smile. That way he holds eye contact just a little too long, like he's trying to sell something. Lindsay barely glanced up from her phone, her fingers tapping non-stop, like she couldn't spare more than half her attention. They sat down in the kitchen, and I poured coffee just like I always do. Out of habit more than anything, I made a comment. Offhand. Really? I said I still had a little savings tucked away for emergencies. I meant it to reassure them. Brian laughed. Not a chuckle. Not a warm smile, he actually laughed. Head back. The kind of laugh that cuts, like I'd said something completely ridiculous. And Lindsay? She just nodded vaguely, as if I hadn't just been dismissed, like a confused old lady at her own table. I remember staring down at the coffee cup in my hands, the heat from it fading fast. That moment, it stayed with me. Not because of the money, but because of what that laugh meant. And that was the moment I knew something wasn't right. And it wasn't just the coffee growing cold in my hands, it was the feeling that maybe I was no longer the one in control. I've always been a quiet woman. Not timid, just the kind who finds peace in routine. In the small things. After Walter passed, I told myself that silence was just part of aging, that the stillness around the house was just life adjusting. But that Sunday afternoon, as I sat at my own kitchen table, holding a cup that had long gone lukewarm, something shifted. Brian's laugh had pulled a thread loose. And suddenly, all the things I'd been overlooking started to unravel. It wasn't just what he said. It was what he didn't say. There was this tone one I'd heard before, though I didn't want to admit it. That soft condescension people use when they're trying to sound helpful. But they've already decided you don't know what's best for yourself. I'd seen it creeping in. The way decisions were made around me. Not with me. The way they'd say things like, "You don't need to worry about that." Or, "Let us handle it." Like I was being gently pushed into a corner labeled harmless and out of the way. And for a long time, I went along with it. I told myself it was love. That letting them take the lead was part of being a good mom. A supportive grandmother. That stepping back was just another way to make room. But that day, something became painfully clear. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even about money. It was about control. Brian didn't see me as someone capable of making decisions anymore. That laugh wasn't about a dollar figure, it was about how absurd it was to him that I thought I still had a say. I looked in the hallway mirror later that evening, and didn't see a woman who was fragile or out of touch. I saw someone who'd spent a lifetime working side by side with her husband. Scrubbing laundry machines. Counting coins late into the night. Making ends meet from nothing but grit and faith. Walter and I built our life one hard-earned step at a time. And now my own son had started to treat me like a burden wrapped in politeness. That was the moment I stopped making excuses. Not for Brian. Not for Lindsay. Not for the way I'd let my silence be mistaken for weakness. It was time to change the story. And just a few days later, the phone rang, and that call was the spark that lit everything. 3 days after that visit, the phone rang while I was making tea. It was around 9 in the morning. That soft hour when sunlight drifts through the kitchen blinds and everything feels harmless. I remember hesitating for a second. Numbers from the bank usually meant another sales pitch or survey. But something told me to answer. The voice on the other end was calm. Professional. He introduced himself as a senior account manager from my local branch. He said he needed to confirm a few changes recently submitted to my account. At first, I didn't understand. I hadn't made any changes. My accounts had been the same for years, steady. Predictable. Like the rhythm of my mornings. So when he mentioned a request to update ownership and assign a new primary holder, my breath caught before I could even ask who. It was Brian. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. My mind started racing. Surely this was some mistake. Maybe it was paperwork from years ago. But no. It was recent. He'd tried to take control of everything: my savings, my checking, even the small trust Walter and I had built together, and he hadn't said a word. The man on the phone explained that the request hadn't gone through because my signature was missing. That one small absence had stopped everything. If it hadn't been for that, my son would have legally owned every dollar in my name. I remember leaning against the counter, my hand gripping the edge until my knuckles went white. The kettle began to whistle in the background. But I didn't move. The only sound I could hear was my heartbeat, slow, heavy, steady. For a moment, I didn't feel angry. I felt hollow. Like someone had quietly reached inside my life and started rearranging it without permission. The representative assured me that he'd flagged the request for review and that everything was still under my control. He even thanked me for verifying. But when the call ended, the silence that filled the room felt different than before, thicker somehow. More deliberate. I stood there for a long time, the tea untouched, trying to understand how it had come to this. How the boy who once cried when I left him at kindergarten, who once promised to protect me, had become a man who would go behind my back for control. And yet, beneath the hurt, something else began to stir. Not rage, not even sadness. Something keener. Heavier clarity. I realized that this wasn't just about money. It was about the story of my life. One I had allowed others to write for far too long. That evening, I found an old blue notebook in the drawer by the sink. The one Walter used to call my ledger of life. I opened to a blank page and began to write. The date? The name of the man who called. What Brian had tried to do. And then, 4 words that I underlined twice. I am still the owner. That was the moment I took the first piece of myself back. And by the next morning, I knew exactly what I had to do. The next morning, I brewed Earl Grey instead of my usual coffee strong. With lemon. The way Walter used to like it. Something about that small change felt symbolic. Like I was stepping into a new rhythm. Not rushed. Not angry. Just clear. I sat at the kitchen table with my old notebook in front of me. The entry from the night before stared back. I am still the owner. 4 simple words that had lit a fuse in me. And now, I needed to protect what they meant. For years, I thought keeping the peace was love. I thought silence meant strength. I thought staying out of the way was the right thing to do. But I see it now. My silence didn't just protect others. It erased me. One small surrender at a time. That morning, I started making a list not of errands or groceries, but of the areas of my life I had quietly handed over without even realizing it. Decisions about my own money, where I spent holidays, who held the passwords, even the smallest things, like when to replace the roof or how often the lawn got mowed. All of it, little by little, had been taken from my hands under the disguise of help, and I had let it happen. By the time sunlight reached across the table, that list filled half a page. Later that week, I drove to the bank. The air was crisp, and the sky had that freshly washed look it gets after a rainstorm. I parked across the street and sat in my car for a moment, watching people go in and out of the building. Young professionals, a woman with a stroller, a man holding his mother's hand. They all looked like they had purpose. I couldn't remember the last time I felt that way. Inside, the bank was quiet and smelled faintly of old wood and paper. At the front, a young woman greeted me politely. But before I could say anything, a man stepped out from behind the counter. He recognized me. He was the one who had called Philip. The account manager. He remembered my name, shook my hand, and led me to a small glass-walled office. No rush. No pressure. Just that calm, respectful energy I'd forgotten people could offer me. He showed me the documents Brian had submitted. They weren't minor updates. He had requested full control power of attorney, card access, changes to the trust, not assistance, not support, total authority. I didn't flinch. I'd already guessed. But seeing it confirmed made something settle deep in my chest. This was no longer about convenience. It was about who I was allowed to be. So I looked Philip in the eye, handed him a paper I'd prepared, and told him what I wanted. Lock the accounts. Remove all secondary access. Dissolve the old trust. No joint holders. No linked cards. No exceptions. When he asked if I was sure, I didn't hesitate to. I told him I was done being managed. That was the moment he looked at me, not like a client. Not like a frail old woman, but with something else. Respect. 2 evenings later, I heard a knock on the door. It was close to 6:30. The sun already sinking behind the maple trees in my yard. When I looked through the window, I saw Lindsay standing on the porch, wrapped in an oversized coat, sunglasses still on, though the light was fading. I remember feeling a strange calm wash over me. I knew this visit wasn't about concern. It was about control, the kind that hides behind polite smiles and soft voices. When I opened the door, she greeted me with that tight, a rehearsed warmth people use when they've come to fix a problem, but don't want to admit they caused it. She said Brian had been stressed. That business had been unpredictable lately. That everything he did was for the sake of the family's future. The word legacy slipped out more than once. And each time she said it, it sounded less like a dream and more like a transaction. She spoke about how I'd always wanted to help. How this was simply another way to make sure everything stayed organized. Safe. Efficient. I could almost admire how carefully she framed her story if I hadn't already known the truth. I let her speak. I didn't interrupt. I simply listened, like I had done most of my life. But this time, my silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. When she finished, I told her I understood perfectly well, that I knew exactly what had been done, and what had been planned. And for the first time, I said what had been sitting on my tongue for years, that helping and being erased are not the same thing. That generosity, when taken for granted, becomes permission for cruelty. Her face flushed, her voice tightened, and the room suddenly felt smaller. She muttered something about family loyalty, about regret, about how I'd misunderstood, but the only misunderstanding was hers. She thought I'd stay quiet forever. As she left, she warned that I'd regret my decisions. But when the door closed behind her, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the kind that comes from keeping the peace. The kind that comes from finally standing in it. That night, I sat by the window watching the lights flicker on across the street. The house was silent, but not lonely. And for the first time, I felt like the walls around me didn't just hold memories, they held boundaries. The day after Lindsay came by, the house settled back into its usual rhythm. I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed. I glanced down and saw Anna's name. It surprised me. At 17, my granddaughter lived in a world that moved faster than mine: school, friends, her phone always lighting up. She rarely called. So when she did, I knew it wasn't nothing. Her voice was soft, a little hesitant. She asked how I was doing, if everything was okay. I told her I was fine. And I meant it. Not the kind of fine you say to keep things easy, but the kind that comes from knowing you've finally drawn a line in the sand. She asked if she could come by later that day, and I said of course. When she arrived, she came in like a swirl of energy, half teenager, half young woman trying to make sense of the world. She hugged me tighter than usual. I didn't ask why. I just pulled out the cookie dough I'd been saving, and we filled the kitchen with the scent of butter and sugar. We sat and talked about school, her drawings, how she was thinking of applying to a few out-of-state colleges. She lit up when she spoke about art, her eyes dancing in a way that reminded me of her father when he was younger, before the weight of expectations dulled his edges. Then she went quiet, told me her dad had been acting off, angry, restless, something about the bank. I didn't dodge the truth. I told her he had tried to take control of my accounts without telling me, that he assumed I wouldn't understand, or maybe that I wouldn't notice. Her face changed, part disbelief, part shame that she hadn't known. She said she thought I liked helping them, that I'd always been the one to say yes. And I told her something I had only recently learned myself, that saying yes out of habit isn't kindness, it's erasure. And that just because you've been generous doesn't mean others are entitled to take. I walked to the cabinet and pulled down a folder I'd prepared. On the front was her name. Inside, a trust for her education. She didn't speak, just looked at me with wide eyes. In that moment, I saw it. She didn't want my money. She wanted my trust. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like someone in my family truly saw me. The next morning, I didn't wait. By 9:15, I was downtown, sitting across from my attorney in his small office lined with books and quiet. Martin Halverson had been my lawyer for over a decade, steady, discreet, the kind of man who respected silence without assuming it meant weakness. I told him I wanted to make changes. Big ones. We went through everything, line by line. I asked to dissolve the old family trust, every clause that named Brian and Lindsay as future beneficiaries. I wanted my decisions reflected not just in intention, but in law. There would be no room for misinterpretation. Martin raised his eyebrows slightly but didn't question me. He'd seen enough family drama to know that the loudest voices are rarely the most deserving. Then he asked if I wanted to include a statement of intent, something to explain the changes should anyone challenge them later. I paused. For most of my life, I'd explained things, smoothed them over, softened my boundaries to keep others comfortable. But this time, I didn't want to soften anything. I wanted clarity. So I took the pen, and I wrote slowly, word by word. To anyone who wonders why I left my estate to my granddaughter and not my son or his wife, I offer this: Anna never asked me to disappear. That was it. No bitterness. No defense. Just truth. When we finalized the papers, I signed each one with hands that no longer trembled. With each stroke of ink, I felt something leave me, not grief, not resentment, but the burden of waiting for permission to protect myself. On the way home, I stopped by a little cafe Walter and I used to love. I ordered a hot cup of black tea, sat by the window, and watched the world pass by. The sky was pale blue, like watercolor stretched across the horizon. Fragile, beautiful, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to rush home to check something, fix something, or be available to someone. I just was. I had always thought legacy was money, or a house, or the name on a document. But now I know it's the choices we make when no one's watching. The ones that protect who we are, not just what we leave behind. It was late afternoon when the phone rang. I knew who it was before I even picked up. Brian. The sound of his name alone used to soften me, make me second-guess myself. Wonder if I was overreacting. Not this time. His voice came through sharp, breathless, already laced with frustration. He'd just spoken to the bank. They told him everything. The revoked access, the frozen trust, my decisions. And for the first time, I didn't flinch. He didn't ask questions. He demanded answers. Said I couldn't just make changes like that without talking to him first. That I was being unfair. That this affected everyone. Not just me. I listened to him. Not to be persuaded, but to finally understand the pattern. Every word was coded in the same belief that I owed him explanation. Access. Control. That the systems we had were permanent because they benefited him. He said I was overreacting. I told him he said that because it was easier than admitting he'd overstepped. He tried to coax me. The way he used to when he was little before asking for something, he already assumed he'd get. He reminded me of how much I'd always wanted to help. How I believed in family. How this wasn't about control but protection. But I saw through it now. I reminded him that I still believe in helping family. That's why I protected the part that still sees me as family. The part that never once asked me to vanish to be useful. There was a pause. Long. Heavy. Then the bitterness came through. He accused me of cutting them off. After everything they'd done. But that's just it, I wasn't cutting them off. I was cutting myself free. And those are not the same thing. He warned me that I'd regret it. That I was making a mistake. That I was burning bridges I couldn't rebuild. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. Not in anger. In peace. Because I wasn't burning anything. I was walking away from a fire that had been smoldering beneath my feet for years. I told him that what I truly regretted was every time I said yes when my whole body wanted to say no. Every holiday I let someone else decide. Every decision I stayed silent through, just to keep the illusion of harmony. I hung up with a stillness I hadn't known in decades. No shaking hands. No pounding heart. Just quiet. Powerful quiet. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen and wrote a new entry in my notebook. Today, I spoke up not to argue, but to exist, and with those words, I felt something settle inside me. Not an ending, but a beginning I didn't even know I'd been waiting for. A week passed. No calls. No knocks on the door. I thought that might be the end of it. But one quiet Sunday morning, just after 10:30, I heard a soft knock. When I opened the door, Brian stood there. No folder. No paperwork. Just a brown paper bag in one hand and a quiet, unsure smile on his face. He told me he brought lunch. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My instincts, those years of mothering, of smoothing things over, tugged at me. But I didn't move out of habit. I stepped aside because something in his eyes wasn't asking for permission, it was asking for a chance. We sat at the kitchen table. The same place where months ago he'd laughed at me. Called my independence a joke, without even realizing it. Inside the bag were 2 turkey sandwiches, coleslaw, and a bag of chips. My usual. Back when we used to eat out together more often. He remembered. I noticed how quiet he was. Not in a sulking way, but reflective. His shoulders were lower. His voice softer. He told me Anna had shown him her notebook. Said she'd written about me. About the changes. About how I taught her that it was okay to say no. That being kind didn't mean being erased. He said something shifted when he read her words. That they made him see himself more clearly, how he'd gotten used to my silence. My support. As something guaranteed. Something passive. But I wasn't passive. I had simply been patient. And now that patience had run out, I wasn't angry. Just awake. I listened as he spoke, not to argue. Not to forgive. But to witness. There's something powerful in watching someone try. Not because they have to, but because they finally want to. He admitted he made me small. Not out of cruelty, but carelessness. Out of the assumption that I'd always just be there, holding everything together quietly in the background. And for the first time, I saw in him not the son who had disappointed me, but the boy who used to hold my hand when he was scared. The boy I raised. The boy who was still in there. Beneath all the ego and excuses, I told him I didn't need an apology. What I needed was awareness. And he nodded, not defensively, but like someone who finally understood the weight of what had been lost. Before he left, he handed me a card. Inside was just one line. Thank you for teaching me what you never owed me. It wasn't an apology. It was something better. Understanding. Later that night, as the candles flickered and the kitchen hummed with peace, I opened my old blue notebook and wrote one last line. I am no longer quiet. I am no longer erased. I am home. And that's when it hit me. Legacy isn't money. It isn't property. It's not a name carved into stone or a check written out in silence. Legacy is the feeling we leave behind when we stop explaining ourselves and just live our truth. It's Anna, pausing before saying yes to something that doesn't feel right. It's Brian, coming to lunch without needing to win. And it's me, walking into my own kitchen and no longer feeling like a guest. If you're still waiting for someone to give you permission to take your power back, stop waiting. You've always had it. And if this story reminded you of someone who gave everything and asked for nothing, share it. Let them know you see them. Let them know their silence was never small. Because some truths are too important to whisper. And some of us, well, we've waited long enough to be heard. If this story meant something to you, please like, share, or leave a comment. Someone else might need to hear it too.